In the spring of 1856, the earth around Darrow Plantation seemed to breathe sorrow. Rows of apple trees stretched toward the horizon, their blossoms pale as bone, their roots tangled in ground that had known too much blood. Behind the orchard, a small patch of land was fenced off not for the masters, but for the slaves who had died under their rule. Few dared to linger there. But one night, as the moon climbed high and silvered the headstones, a lone figure knelt among them, not a slave, but Evelyn Darrow, the master's wife. Hidden among the shadows, Isaac, a field slave known for his silence, watched her weep beside the graves. What she whispered into the soil that night and what Isaac did afterward would unravel everything the plantation believed about mercy, sin, and justice. The moon was swollen that night. A silver lantern hung low above the orchard. Isaac had been sent to fetch water from the well behind the stables, but he'd taken the long path, the one that curved past the old graves. He liked the quiet there. It was the only place on the plantation where nobody called his name. But as he neared the fence, he heard something, not the cry of a night bird, not the hum of insects. It was a sound that didn't belong to the night, a human sound. A woman, weeping. Isaac froze. He crouched low behind a mulberry tree and peered through the branches. There, in the moonlight, knelt Miss Evelyn, her nightgown trailing in the dirt, her hair undone. The candle in her hand flickered wildly, casting trembling light over the graves. She wasn't supposed to be there. White women didn't come to the slave graves. Isaac felt his chest tighten. He should have turned back, but something, curiosity, pity, or maybe the strange pull of sorrow, kept him rooted to the spot. He watched as Evelyn touched the headstone nearest her, tracing her fingers over the carved initials, E.L. "Emily Lee," she whispered, voice cracking. "Oh, sweet child, I'm so sorry." Isaac knew that name. Emily had been a housemaid just 16 who died the winter before. The official word was fever, but everyone in the quarters knew she'd fallen pregnant, and that the fever was just a name they gave to shame. Evelyn's sobs deepened. "He told me it was a lie," she said softly, shaking her head. "But I saw her eyes. They looked just like his." Isaac's breath hitched. He knew exactly what she meant. Master Thomas Darrow's sins weren't secret, they just weren't spoken aloud. Every field hand, every maid, every overseer knew. But hearing her say it, the master's wife felt like lightning cutting through still air. Then Evelyn reached into the folds of her gown and pulled something from her pocket, a small silver locket. She pressed it into the soil beside Emily's grave. "He can burn me for it if he wants," she whispered. "But I won't hide for him anymore." Isaac felt a weight shift in his chest. He didn't understand what made him move. Maybe it was the way she said it. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled. But before he knew it, he stepped forward. The grass crunched beneath his bare feet. Evelyn turned sharply, candlelight flaring against her face. For a heartbeat, she looked like a ghost herself, pale, wide-eyed, almost radiant. "Who's there?" she gasped. Isaac dropped to one knee. "It's just me, ma'am, Isaac." Her shoulders eased slightly, though her breath still came quick. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "No one should." Isaac lowered his gaze. "I ain't mean no harm, ma'am. I just," he hesitated, "heard you crying." For a long time, neither spoke. The orchard whispered around them, wind brushing the branches like fingers. Then, softly, Evelyn said, "Do you believe the dead can hear us, Isaac?" He swallowed. "My mama used to say they can. Said the ground keeps secrets better than people do." Evelyn gave a broken laugh, bitter as vinegar. "Then maybe it's the only thing that will keep mine." She turned back to the graves, her voice trembling. "Do you know what your master did to her?" Isaac didn't answer. He didn't have to. Evelyn pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking. "He told me she died of sickness. He even let the preacher say her soul was clean. But I know what he did. I saw him with her the night before she fell ill." Her confession hung in the air like smoke. Then Evelyn looked at Isaac. Truly looked not as a slave, but as a man who had seen the same darkness she had. "They think we're blind, Isaac," she said. "All of us. You, me, the ones in the ground. But I see it now. I see everything." Isaac's voice came low, steady. Then you see what the rest of us been livin', ma'am. Evelyn nodded slowly, tears gleaming in the candlelight. I do, and I can't live with it anymore. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Tomorrow, he'll ride to Mobile. When he's gone, I'll send word to the magistrate. Someone must know what he's done. Isaac felt the ground tilt beneath him. Ma'am, if you do that, I know what it means, she said quietly, but I can't let another girl end up here. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of the river. Somewhere far off, a whip-poor-will cried. Evelyn turned toward the house, her candlelight flickering against the trees. Before she left, she looked back at Isaac. You didn't see me here tonight, she said, but if anything happens to me, you remember what I said. Isaac bowed his head. Yes, ma'am. And as she walked away, her white gown fading into the orchard shadows, Isaac stood among the graves, the locket glinting faintly in the dirt, and realized that something terrible and holy had just begun. The morning after Evelyn's midnight visit to the graves, the plantation woke to a stillness that felt wrong. The sky hung low and gray, and the air had the scent of rain and something else, iron, maybe, or sorrow waiting to fall. Isaac rose before dawn as usual, washing his hands in the trough before heading to the fields. But his thoughts weren't on the rows of cotton that needed picking. They were on her, the mistress, and what she had said beside the graves. He couldn't shake the image, her kneeling in the dirt, whispering to the dead, leaving that silver locket behind like a prayer or a curse. He had seen death often enough to know when a soul was readying itself for it. That morning, she had looked like someone halfway between the living and the gone. By noon, the storm broke. Thunder rolled across the horizon like the growl of something ancient. The wind carried grit through the air, stinging eyes and skin. Overseer Boone barked orders through the rain, his whip coiling in his hand, but even he seemed uneasy. The weather made men restless. The air was too thick for cruelty. Isaac worked until the rain became a downpour, then ducked into the shed behind the smokehouse for shelter. There, through the sheets of rain, he saw something strange smoke rising from the big house chimney, thick and black. Smoke didn't usually come that color unless something was burning that shouldn't be. Then, faintly, came a shout. Fire! Isaac ran without thinking. Slaves and house servants were already gathering near the veranda, faces pale beneath the rain. But it wasn't the house that was on fire. It was the orchard. And standing at its edge, soaked and trembling, was Evelyn Darrow. Her white dress clung to her body, streaked with soot. Beside her, the old oak tree that marked the slave graves blazed with a red fury, its branches crackling in the rain. "Get water!" Boone shouted. But his voice faltered when Master Darrow himself appeared on the porch, pistol in hand, his face twisted with rage. "What in God's name is this?" he thundered. "Evelyn." She turned slowly, her hair plastered to her cheeks. "It's the only way," she said softly. "You won't bury another one of them in silence." Thomas Darrow's jaw clenched. "You've lost your mind." He strode forward through the rain, grabbed her arm, and yanked her back toward the house. "What have you done?" Evelyn struggled, shouting over the roar of the storm. "I set them free, Thomas. The ones you buried in shame. You'll not hide them beneath your lies anymore." The field hands stood frozen, watching. Isaac could barely breathe. He wanted to step forward, but one look from Boone's whip held him still. Then Thomas struck her. The sound cracked louder than thunder. Evelyn stumbled, her knees sinking into the mud, blood on her lip. "Put out that fire," Thomas roared to Boone, "and get her inside." Boone gestured for two men to help her up, but Evelyn jerked away from them. Her voice came hoarse, fierce. "You think fire can hide sin? It only shows what's been rotting underneath." Thomas's face darkened. Enough. He turned toward the burning oak, where the flames were dying under the rain. Something silver glimmered in the mud near the roots. He bent down, reached for it, and froze. It was the locket. He wiped the soot from its face and pried it open. Inside was a faded scrap of ribbon pink, frayed, with two initials embroidered in tiny letters. E.L. Emily Lee. Thomas's hand trembled. Then his eyes lifted straight to Evelyn. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. Evelyn didn't answer. "Where?" His voice cracked like a whip. She looked at him with a strange calm. "She gave it to me," she said, "before she died. Said to keep it safe so the truth wouldn't die with her." Thomas's face went pale. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to go still, even the rain paused. Then he lunged forward and seized her by the throat. "You're lying." Too. Isaac felt something inside him break. He moved before he knew it, stepping from the crowd. "Master, please." Thomas turned, eyes blazing. "You stay out of this." But Isaac didn't. His voice came steady despite the fear burning in his chest. "She tellin' the truth." For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the mud. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I saw her last night," Isaac said, forcing the words out. "She went to the graves, left that locket there. Said she was going to tell the magistrate." A murmur rippled through the servants. Boone cursed under his breath. Thomas's grip loosened on Evelyn. He turned back to Isaac, his expression something between disbelief and horror. "You watched her? Spied on your mistress?" "I ain't spying," Isaac said. "I was fetching water." Thomas stared at him for a long, awful moment, then laughed a broken, bitter sound. "Of course. The two of you. The mad wife and the insolent slave. I should have known." He lifted his pistol. Evelyn screamed, "No!" The shot cracked the air like lightning. Birds scattered from the orchard. Isaac stumbled backward, not from pain, but from shock. The bullet had missed him by inches, striking the tree behind. Before Thomas could fire again, Evelyn lunged. She struck his arm, the pistol flew from his hand, and they fell into the mud together, thrashing. Boone moved to pull them apart, but Evelyn grabbed the locket from Thomas's hand and flung it into the burning roots of the oak. The fire hissed, swallowing the silver whole. "You'll never bury her again," she cried. Thomas roared, shoving her away, but by then Boone had reached him, dragging him back toward the house. Evelyn collapsed in the mud, shaking, soaked through with rain and tears. Isaac rushed to her side. She looked up at him, eyes dazed. "He'll kill me for this," she whispered. Isaac shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not if I get to him first." Her gaze met his. Something fierce and final flickered between them. She nodded once. Then, through the rain and smoke, the two of them watched the oak crumble the fire, hissing its last breath, and beneath it, the graves seemed to sigh as if freed at last. But both of them knew the fire had only begun. The morning after the fire, the Darrow plantation looked as if God himself had laid a hand upon it. The oak by the graves was gone, only a blackened skeleton remained, jutting from the wet earth like the bones of some ancient creature. The smell of smoke clung to everything. Thomas Darrow did not speak a word all morning. He sat at the long dining table, his untouched breakfast cooling before him, his eyes glassy and fixed. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. No one dared to ask where she was. By mid-afternoon, rumors were already crawling through the quarters like restless ants. Some said she had fled into the swamp. Others swore they'd seen her carriage leave under the moonlight. A few whispered that she'd been locked in the cellar, Thomas's private punishment for her madness. Isaac said nothing, but in his chest, dread beat like a second heart. He couldn't stop thinking about the last look in her eyes, wild, frightened, and knowing. When Overseer Boone came around at dusk, shouting that work would resume as if nothing had happened, Isaac caught a glimpse of something new in the man's eyes. Fear. Boone had always strutted like a dog fattened on cruelty, but now he looked thinner, uncertain. That night, Isaac could not sleep. Rain tapped at the tin roof of the quarters, and every sound seemed too loud: the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the reeds, the quiet sobbing of another slave nearby. He got up before dawn and made his way toward the big house. The air was heavy with fog. He crept around the back porch, to the door near the kitchens, where the scullery maid Ruth sometimes left scraps, but instead of food, he found a trail of muddy footprints, bare, small, and uneven, leading away from the porch into the garden. Evelyn's sighs. He followed them. The tracks led him to the tool shed near the fence line. The door was ajar, and something glinted inside. When he stepped in, he found her shawl torn and damp with blood. For a long moment, Isaac just stared. The world seemed to shrink around that single piece of fabric. He touched it gently, then turned to go. But as he did, he heard it. A faint scrape. Metal on wood. He froze. From behind the barrels, someone moved. Boone stepped out, his face shadowed, his coat collar high. "You shouldn't be here, boy." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Where is she?" Boone's lip curled. Mistress Darrow had a fit of repentance. "Left last night. Said she couldn't live with her sins." "You lyin'." Boone's hand drifted toward the whip on his belt. "Watch your tongue." Isaac took a slow step forward. "You hurt her." Boone laughed softly. "She hurt herself. You saw her crazy as a fox with its leg in a trap. You think I'd waste my time on a woman who—" He didn't finish. Isaac lunged, catching him by the throat. They slammed against the wall of the shed, the old boards creaking. Boone tried to draw his knife, but Isaac's hand closed around his wrist and twisted. "You tell me where she is," Isaac growled, his voice low. "Dangerous." Boone's eyes bulged. "You'll hang for this." Isaac pressed harder. "Then I hang knowing the truth." Boone's boot slipped in the mud. His head hit the wall with a dull crack. His breath rattled once, then went still. Isaac stepped back, chest heaving, the sound of rain outside suddenly deafening. He looked down at Boone's lifeless body. Blood seeped from the overseer's temple, dark as oil. Isaac's hands shook, not from fear but from the certainty that this would not end here. He searched Boone's coat and found a scrap of parchment tucked inside a torn corner of a letter. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably Evelyn's. "If anything happens to me, find the grave that bears no name. The truth sleeps there." Isaac's heart thundered. He waited until midnight before slipping away from the quarters. The fog was thick again, rolling over the fields like breath. When he reached the graveyard, the burned oak loomed above the mounds of dirt. Most of the headstones were chipped or blank, but one, at the farthest edge, had no carving at all, just a rough slab of slate pressed into the mud. He knelt before it. The soil there looked disturbed, freshly turned. He dug with his hands until his nails split. After a few minutes, he struck wood, a small box. Inside was the locket, the same one that had burned in the fire. Only it wasn't scorched anymore. It gleamed faintly, as though it had never touched flame. And beside it, folded neatly, was a piece of cloth embroidered with the initials E.L. Evelyn Lee Darrow. The realization struck him like lightning. Emily Lee, the woman whose grave she burned, had been Evelyn's sister. Isaac sat back, trembling. The mistress hadn't been mad at all. She had uncovered the family's oldest sin, that her husband's property included her own kin. He heard footsteps then. Slow, deliberate. Thomas Darrow stepped out from the shadows, pistol in hand, rain dripping from his hat brim. "I knew you'd come here," he said quietly. Isaac rose, the box still in his hands. "She didn't run, did she?" Thomas's eyes were flat. "She tried, but some secrets belong to the earth." Rage flooded Isaac's chest. "You killed her." Thomas leveled the pistol. "She chose her end. Don't make her mistake." For a moment, neither moved. Then lightning split the sky, and the graveyard erupted in white light. A shot rang out. When the thunder faded, only the rain remained. By dawn, the field hands found the graveyard in ruin. Footprints, blood, and 2 sets of tracks leading toward the swamp and never returning. Some said Thomas shot the slave and fell into the mud trying to drag the body. Others whispered the slave had dragged him down instead. But Ruth, the kitchen maid, swore she saw something else that morning, a figure in a pale dress standing by the burnt oak, holding a silver locket that glowed even through the fog. Then, as she watched, the figure vanished. Weeks passed after that stormy night, yet the Darrow plantation never recovered its rhythm. The cotton fields that once shimmered silver under the sun now stood limp and yellowed. The workers moved slower, whispering among themselves. Even the air seemed to carry a strange weight, a tension that settled over everything like fog. Thomas Darrow's body was never found. His pistol was discovered by the swamp's edge, half buried in the mud, and his boots one upright, one floating downstream. The sheriff came once, rode through the estate, took one look at the frightened faces of the enslaved, and left without a word. No one asked questions after that. But the stories began. They said Thomas had been dragged into the swamp by hands that weren't human. They said the land itself had swallowed him whole, as penance for what he'd done. And when the mist rose at dawn, you could see him or something like him standing at the tree line, staring toward the graves. Evelyn's name was never spoken in the big house again. Her portraits were taken down, her dresses packed into trunks and locked away. But every night, someone heard her humming, softly, near the old oak. Ruth, who had seen the woman in white, stopped going near the graveyard altogether. "Ain't no restin' spirit there," she whispered one night as they huddled near the fire. "That's a warnin' one. Ain't at peace, ain't gone neither." Isaac's name, too, became a ghost's. The others swore he had escaped, fled north, found freedom. But when the wind howled through the cabins, it carried his voice calling, searching, almost pleading. And then the locket began to move. No one knew who found it first. Some said it appeared on the doorstep of the big house one morning, shining clean despite the mud. Others claimed Ruth discovered it lying on her windowsill, the initials E, L, glinting in the moonlight. Wherever it came from, one thing was certain: every person who touched it began to change. The first was Mistress Darrow's maid, Clara. She picked it up while sweeping and kept it hidden beneath her pillow, saying it was too pretty to waste. Within days, she stopped eating. She woke screaming at night, saying she saw a woman standing over her bed with hair wet from rain and eyes full of sorrow. By the third night, Clara was gone. They found her the next morning at the edge of the swamp, barefoot, her face peaceful, the locket clasped in her hand. After that, nobody dared touch it. The slaves begged the overseer to bury it, but the overseer laughed. "Superstitious nonsense," he said. He tossed it in a drawer in the parlor. That very night, the drawer slid open by itself. The overseer's wife swore she saw it. The next morning, the overseer's horse was found dead, its throat torn open. And the drawer? Empty. The plantation descended into quiet madness. Animals stopped breeding. Lanterns flickered even when there was no wind. A baby born in the slave quarters wouldn't stop crying until its mother rubbed dirt from the graveyard across its forehead. And each evening, as dusk fell, the humming returned, the same tune Evelyn used to hum while tending her roses. One evening, Ruth found herself drawn toward the burned oak. She didn't know why. Something pulled at her heart, soft but insistent. When she reached the graves, the air smelled faintly of lavender, Evelyn's perfume. At the base of the tree, half buried in the ash, lay the locket once again. Ruth hesitated. "Lord, don't make me," she whispered. But her hand moved anyway. The moment her fingers brushed the silver, her vision blurred. The world melted away. She saw the big house as it once was, new, bright, alive. She saw Evelyn laughing in the garden with another woman, her twin by face and grace, Emily Lee. She saw Thomas watching from the balcony, his expression dark. Then came the night, the betrayal, the screams, the fire. And she saw Isaac, standing in the rain, holding Evelyn's body, whispering something she couldn't hear. Then everything went black. When Ruth woke, it was morning. The locket was gone again. But around the graves, small white flowers had sprouted, overnight lilies. Evelyn's favorite. She ran back to the cabins, breathless, trembling. "She ain't restin'," Ruth told them. "She trying to tell something buried still." From that day forward, the slaves began digging near the graves. Quietly, at night. They said Evelyn's spirit wouldn't stop until the truth was unearthed. And they were right. On the third night of digging, their shovels struck wood, another box, larger than the first. Inside were bones, small bones, children's, wrapped in a woman's shawl. No one spoke. Isaac hadn't been seeking freedom that night, he'd been seeking justice. Evelyn hadn't gone mad, she'd discovered what her husband had done. The graves near the oak weren't for slaves. They were for the children Thomas had fathered and buried when their existence threatened his reputation. Ruth fell to her knees, weeping. The air turned bitter cold, and through the mist, a figure took shape, pale, graceful, eyes glistening with tears. Evelyn. She looked down at the box, then at the trembling group before her. "Now you know," her voice whispered through the wind. "Now you see." And then she was gone. By dawn, every slave on the plantation had fled. The fields stood empty, the cabins silent. When travelers passed by weeks later, they found the Darrow estate abandoned, the windows shattered, the walls scorched again, and carved into the door, deep and precise, were 3 letters, E-L-I. No one ever lived there again. Some nights, locals said, you could still see lantern light moving near the graves and hear a woman's voice singing softly, as if rocking lost children to sleep. By the spring of 1849, the Darrow plantation had become a wound upon Alabama's earth. The cotton fields were wild now, tangled with weeds and briars, and the big house sagged like an old corpse, half swallowed by vines. People traveling the river road crossed themselves when they passed it. No one bought the land. No one stayed after sundown, until Edwin Locke came. A northern investor with a taste for risk and profit, Locke scoffed at the tales. "Ghosts don't scare me," he told the county clerk, signing the deed with a grin. "Only debts do." He arrived with workers, horses, and planks to rebuild. He ordered the graves fenced off, the cabins torn down. "We'll start fresh," he said. "No need to dwell on the dead." But the land remembered. The first warning came that night. His foreman, Briggs, woke screaming that something was walking the fields barefoot, white as ash. In the morning, the horses were found tangled in their reins, their eyes wide open, their tongues black. Locke ordered the men not to talk. "Superstition," he spat. "Get back to work." By the 3rd day, the digging began again. The laborers, mostly freedmen hired from nearby counties, complained that the soil bled. Wherever their shovels struck, a dark fluid seeped through thick and red-brown. When they refused to touch it, Locke himself stepped forward, laughing, and scooped some up in his hand. "Just mud," he said, but the mud didn't wash off. That evening, Locke sat alone in the parlor, scrubbing his hand raw in a basin of lye water. Still, the stain lingered, faint but pulsing, as though something beneath his skin beat with a different rhythm. Then came the humming. At first, he thought it was one of the workers, a woman perhaps, singing to herself. But the sound was too close, too soft, drifting from somewhere deep within the house. It was the same melody Evelyn Darrow had once hummed in her garden, though Locke couldn't have known that. When he followed the sound upstairs, he found a door open that should have been nailed shut, the master bedroom, and there, on the windowsill, lay a silver locket. The initials E.L. gleamed under the moonlight. He reached for it. The humming stopped. The next morning, Briggs found him sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. His eyes were open, but they didn't see. "She showed me," Locke murmured. "She showed me everything." He refused to explain further. That night, he hanged himself from the same oak where the Darrows were buried. Word spread through the county again, the curse is alive. The workers scattered, leaving their tools behind. The sheriff came once more, older now, hands shaking. He nailed a board across the gate and declared the land condemned. But the stories didn't stop. People said that every spring, someone new came, a speculator, a wanderer, a fool, and that every one of them vanished by midsummer. The few who returned spoke of dreams where children's laughter echoed under the soil, and of a woman with pale eyes whispering, "The earth remembers." Years later, Ruth, old and bent-backed, returned to the county. She walked the road in silence, a shawl over her gray hair. Folks said she'd been living in Mobile, helping runaway children. But now she came back, saying she had unfinished business. She found the plantation exactly as she remembered, except quieter. The graves were covered in wildflowers now, and the old oak stood split in two, hollowed by lightning. At its roots lay the locket. Ruth knelt and touched it gently, her voice soft. "You done what you needed, Miss Evelyn. But this land's still cryin'." A wind stirred, warm and heavy. The trees groaned like something waking. Ruth felt it then, the pulse beneath the ground. She began to hum the same tune, low and steady, as she took a small knife from her pocket. She nicked her finger, letting a drop of blood fall into the soil. "Let the bloodline end," she whispered. "Let what was taken be made right." The air thickened. The ground trembled. A faint light began to glow around the graves, not fire, but something soft, white, clean. Through that glow, Ruth saw them. Evelyn, standing tall and calm. Isaac beside her, his face no longer angry but at peace, and between them, the children's small hands clasped, smiling. Evelyn looked at Ruth and nodded once, as if to say, "It's finished." Then the light sank back into the earth. The wind stilled. The hum faded. When Ruth stood, the locket was gone, melted into the soil like dew. She left the plantation at dawn. Behind her, the first true birdsong in decades rose from the trees. The land had taken its last breath of pain. Years passed. The estate turned to ruin, swallowed by moss and time. Travelers who passed through the valley spoke of the White Garden, a patch of land where lilies grew even in winter, fed by something holy in the ground. Some said it was haunted still. Others said it had become sacred. In a small church downriver, a preacher kept an old brass button on the altar. Beneath it, on a slip of faded paper, were the words written in a trembling hand, "The earth remembers, but mercy blooms." And when storms swept through Alabama, lightning sometimes struck that valley not in rage, but in light, tracing the shape of a woman's silhouette across the sky. The Darrow name was gone. The house was dust. But Evelyn's song lingered, soft and eternal, carried by every wind that passed over the fields. And if you listened close enough on a quiet night, you could still hear a hum low, tender, and sorrowful as the land that once bled learned, at last, how to breathe again. By 1892, the story of the Darrow plantation had faded into folklore, a caution whispered by elders, a ghost tale to frighten children. The land had changed hands twice more, then been abandoned for good. The house rotted away until only a single chimney stood, blackened and crooked against the horizon. But stories have long roots, and the Darrow name was not quite gone. In the city of Montgomery lived a woman named Clara Beaumont, a schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a quiet air about her. She'd never been told her full family history, but in her grandmother's Bible, tucked between yellowed pages, was a note written in a graceful hand. E.L. Evelyn Locke. Never let them bury the truth. Clara's grandmother had always refused to speak of it, but after her death, Clara couldn't ignore the pull. She'd dreamt for weeks of white lilies growing out of red earth, of a woman humming softly beside a grave. Finally, one Sunday in late summer, she took the train south and walked the dirt road toward the valley that locals still called Darrow's Hollow. It was quiet there. Too quiet. The trees leaned like mourners, their branches heavy with Spanish moss. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no cloud hung in the sky. Clara found what was left of the house a low pile of stone, vines crawling through its bones. The earth beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as if breathing. She knelt, tracing her fingers along the foundation. "This is where it happened," she murmured. An old man appeared from behind the trees, leaning on a cane. His skin was weathered, his eyes bright as wet amber. "You must be Beaumont's girl," he said. "You've got the look." Clara rose, startled. "You knew my family, knew of 'em. My grandmother worked here, long ago. Said the place was cursed by sorrow, a woman's sorrow. She also said one day the bloodkin would come back to listen." Clara felt her heart quicken. "Listen to what?" The man pointed toward the field, now overrun with white blossoms. "To the truth that still sings here." That night, Clara camped by the ruins. She lit a small lamp and opened her grandmother's Bible again. Between the Psalms lay another note, brittle and water-stained. "Isaac, forgive me. I could not save them. The land will remember, but mercy will come through her." Clara read the line over and over. The ink seemed to bleed into the paper like veins, and faintly, beneath the whisper of crickets, she heard it humming. The same tune her mother used to sing when she brushed her hair as a child. She followed the sound into the field. The air shimmered faintly with mist. The lilies glowed under the moonlight, their petals trembling though there was no wind. Then, between two half-buried stones, she saw it a small silver locket, polished clean by time. She picked it up. Inside was a portrait, painted in miniature, a woman with light eyes and soft curls, and beside her, a boy with skin the color of copper and a scar across his cheek. Evelyn Darrow and Isaac. Clara's breath caught. Her fingers trembled. And then, a voice soft, almost kind, spoke behind her. "You've found what I could not bury." Clara turned. A woman stood there, clothed in pale gray, her face calm, her eyes deep pools of sorrow and love. "Evelyn," the ghost smiled faintly. "I carried shame too long. I tried to atone in silence, but silence is just another chain." Clara swallowed hard. "Why show yourself to me?" "Because you are the end of it," Evelyn said. "You carry both names, the one who owned and the ones who were owned. You are the child of what they thought could never join." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "What am I supposed to do?" Evelyn stepped closer, the lilies bowing under her feet. "Tell the story right. Don't let them call it a curse. It was a confession written in blood and forgiven in bloom." As she spoke, the ground stirred. The moonlight dimmed, replaced by a soft golden glow rising from the earth. Figures began to form, men and women, children and elders, their faces serene. Among them, Clara saw Ruth, holding the hand of a boy who smiled at her Isaac. Evelyn turned to them. "It's done," she whispered. The spirits nodded, their shapes dissolving into the light. The glow spread through the field, touching every flower, every stone. Then it sank back into the soil, leaving only stillness and the scent of rain. Clara stood alone, the locket warm in her palm. When she looked down, the lilies had changed, no longer white, but a soft crimson, like dawn. Weeks later, Clara returned to Montgomery. She published a small book called The Darrow Testament, a chronicle of mercy. It told of Evelyn and Isaac, of the land that bled and the woman who made it bloom. People called it fiction. Some dismissed it as superstition. But those who read it late at night said they heard something while turning the pages, a faint hum, like a woman singing to a child. Years passed, and the valley remained untouched. Travelers said the air there always smelled of flowers after rain. Some nights, they saw a light moving through the field, not ghostly, but gentle, like someone tending a garden. And when a breeze swept through the lilies, it carried words that only the quiet could hear. The earth remembers, but mercy blooms. 100 years after Clara Beaumont published The Darrow Testament, the story that began in blood and ended in lilies had found its way into history books, churches, and whispered memories that refused to fade. By the time 1992 came, the land once known as Darrow's Hollow had been purchased by the state of Alabama. Plans were made to clear it, to build a small industrial park, but the bulldozers never touched the soil. Every time they tried, their engines failed, their wheels sank, and the air filled with a smell of lilies. It frightened the workers so badly that the project was abandoned within a month. Not long after, a local historian named Margaret Ellis, a descendant of Clara Beaumont, petitioned the state to preserve the site as a memorial. She called it the Garden of the Unforgotten. She said, "This land doesn't need to be plowed or built upon. It already holds a foundation deeper than brick memory." And so, for the first time since the Darrows had fallen, the land was left to grow wild again. By 2001, the field had become a pilgrimage site. Visitors came from across the South, some descendants of enslaved families, some of the Darrows, some who simply wanted to feel the air that Clara once described as thick with forgiveness. The lilies still bloomed there every spring, blood red at dawn, ivory white by dusk. Scientists claimed it was a rare soil reaction, minerals leaching upward from the swamp. But the old folks knew better. They said it was the breath of the buried, turning sorrow into peace. In the center of the garden stood a simple stone with two names carved together: Evelyn Darrow, Isaac unknown surname. The earth remembers. Beneath it was buried the locket Clara had found that night long ago. Margaret Ellis would visit often, bringing schoolchildren and historians to walk the trails. She would tell them the story not as legend, but as truth, the story of a mistress and a slave whose love defied law, of a boy who carried shame and strength in equal measure, of a woman who listened to ghosts and turned them into grace. And she always ended the tours with the same words Clara once wrote: "Is greater than, mercy is not forgetting. It is remembering and planting something beautiful over the wound." In 2015, Archaeologists uncovered remnants of the old Darrow house foundations beneath the field. They found 2 silver spoons fused together by time, a rusted harmonica, and a set of porcelain buttons, one of which still glimmered faintly gold in the light. Among them, they discovered a single wooden box sealed with wax. Inside lay a letter wrapped in cloth. It was signed simply, "For whoever remembers." The handwriting was shaky but elegant, Clara's own. The letter read, "Is greater than do not let their story be reduced to tragedy. There is love in the ashes. Let the world know it was not sin that cursed this land, but silence." The letter was displayed in Montgomery's state archives. Next to it hung the portrait of Clara, and below it, a single pressed lily still faintly red after more than a century. That same year, a young girl named Amara Lewis, a student at Tuskegee University, visited the garden for her thesis research. She was studying Southern folklore, but when she stepped into the field, she swore she felt something watching her, not with malice, but with recognition. She wandered through the lilies until she reached the memorial stone. As she knelt to read it, the wind lifted her hair, carrying the faintest tune, low, slow, and mournful. She knew it instantly. Her grandmother used to hum it. Amara froze. She'd never been told where the song came from, only that it was older than prayer. Tears stung her eyes. "I think I'm part of this too," she whispered, and somewhere in the hush that followed, a woman's voice, kind and ancient, seemed to answer, "Is greater than, then remember us well." Amara returned to campus and began to dig deeper. What she uncovered shook the historical community. Through preserved ledgers, baptismal records, and fragments of journals, she traced her lineage directly to the Darrow plantation. Her great-great-grandmother, born in 1853, had been listed as Miriam Darrow Mulatto, sold at age 7, and next to her name in faint ink were the initials E.L. Evelyn Locke. The woman who couldn't save them had tried. Amara's research reignited interest in the Darrow story. She worked with local officials to restore the garden's pathways and built a small museum nearby, dedicated not to the horrors of slavery, but to the endurance of memory. She called it the house that forgave itself. On opening day, hundreds came, descendants of both the enslaved and the enslavers. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stood in silence as the wind swept through the lilies. Amara stood by the memorial stone, holding the same harmonica found by archaeologists years before. She lifted it to her lips and played the soft tune she'd heard in the field. The sound drifted through the valley like a sigh of peace. The petals trembled, and for a moment, only a moment, the mist over the field shimmered with shapes. A woman with a shawl around her shoulders, a man beside her, his arm around her waist, a child at their feet, smiling. Then, as the last note faded, the vision dissolved into sunlight. By the time dusk fell, the crowd was gone, but Amara remained. She sat by the memorial stone, journal in her lap, the lilies whispering around her. She wrote the last line of her speech for the museum's archives. "Is greater than history does not rest in books or bones. It breathes through us, every generation that dares to remember. We are not haunted by the past, we are held by it, until we learn its song." As she closed the journal, a warm wind stirred again. The petals brushed against her hand, leaving a faint red stain that shimmered like blood, then faded like light. And from somewhere deep in the earth came that same word Ruth once heard in the swamp, a century and a half before. Done. Amara looked up at the twilight sky, tears on her cheeks but a smile on her lips. The garden glowed faintly, the lilies bowing in unison, as though finally, after generations of sorrow, the land itself was exhaling. And for the first time in its long, haunted history, the earth of the Darrows lay at peace.